Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a review of Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson. Now, I reviewed his debut book, I think it was last year, Open Water, and I was blown away by this guy's ability to write really compelling stories, really compelling characters set in the backdrop of South London. I just loved everything about it. And so I was a little bit nervous about this book. You know, there's always that kind of nervousness or they're really going to be able to meet what they set out to do in their first book. And I have to say, Caleb Azumah Nelson, after reading the second book, has now become a new favourite author of mine. And I cannot wait to read whatever he writes next. He is a phenomenal writer. Absolutely phenomenal. I got approved of this by NetGalley. Thank you, NetGalley, for approving my e-arc. And so without further ado, let's jump into my review. So this book is essentially about the story of a young man who is a British Nigerian in South London. And we are following essentially his life, you know, his relationships with his family, his romantic relationships, his journey at university to getting a job. It's really just about following this person as he goes through his life. And it is one of the most emotional books that I have ever read. This is not going to be a typical review in the sense that I'm going to review the goods and the bads, because there was nothing bad about this book. I loved every single thing about this book. It felt very raw. Just felt like I knew Caleb via his words, if that makes sense. Like it felt very intimate in many ways. And it's one of those books that will stick with me until the end of my time on this planet. There is certain things that he talks about in this book that will feel relatable to anybody who is an immigrant. I am a second generation immigrant. And he talks about the second generation immigrant struggle in a way that I have never ever read before. He talks about the immigrant struggle from our parents' perspective in a way that I have never read before. And I just loved it. I just absolutely devoured it and ate it up. One of the things that he talks a lot about is how, you know, his parents, when they moved from Ghana over to the UK, you know, there's this fear, right? There's this sense of, is this the right decision? How are we going to get money? How are we going to build a family, a career in this country that is ultimately very foreign to us? And he then goes on to shift how he thinks about that as a young man who is, you know, about to go to university, and about how he wants to have a career in something that is very atypical in the kind of African community. Love the way that he addressed it in such a sensitive way about how a lot of the battles that children of immigrants have with their immigrant parents is because of the experiences they had when they came over to this country. The thing is, our experiences as second generation immigrants is very different to the experience our parents had, because the world has changed quite a lot since when, you know, my parents at least came to the UK. It's just this really beautiful vignette into the struggle that we have as children of first generation immigrants, where we're trying to pave our own way, but because our parents have the same fears when they first came over, they in some ways can hinder that. They can hinder that curiosity and that wonder and that desire to do things that are maybe a little bit different to what our parents had to do. And it was very emotional. Like, it felt very emotional to me because coming from South Asia, I think there are a lot of parallels between the African community and the South Asian community, and probably any immigrant community, to be honest. I think there's a lot of parallels in the struggles that we have. I just think he captured it really wonderfully. And I think one thing that he does really well, amongst many other things, is how he relates family struggle to that, because there is this constant battle between surviving versus thriving. He really sets up the family dynamic in a way that feels quite uncomfortable but also very real. So I'll give you an example. He talks a lot about how when he's applying to universities, he wants to study music because he loves music. And I'll come on to music in a second, because music plays a huge role in Caleb Azumah Nelson's writing. But he talks about how he wants to study music and create music and really be engrossed in that world, but ultimately he decides to do business at university because that's what his dad tells him to do, because it will give him stability. It's a much more safer option. You're much more likely to make money from it as soon as you leave university. And because of that, he abandons his dream. He abandons his dream of creating music and learning about music, because his father is essentially bringing up his trauma of not being able to do what he wanted because he had to abandon what he wanted for safety and stability. And I just thought that was really interesting. I mean, I've definitely had conversations like that with my family. I mean, My mum is the most supportive person ever. I remember when I was applying to university, I really was adamant about studying philosophy with AI. And, you know, a lot of people will make jokes that, you know, philosophy, you know, it's not the most useful degree necessarily. But I disagree. Like, philosophy is the degree to do if you want to learn how to think critically. And not many people, believe it or not, can actually think critically. I was very lucky that my mum was like, okay, ultimately I trust your judgment, so if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. But I know many people who've had to do medicine and law and dentistry when that's the antithesis of what they want to do. And I just think that's really sad. Like, I think it's really sad, but because of the trauma that our parents have had, you know, we are, in some regards, thankfully not me, but other people are forced to give up their dreams in the name of something else, when ultimately we never really know what's going to happen. I mean, you might study music and you might become very good at it and be very successful at it. You might study business and have the complete opposite experience and not do very well in business. So I think he captures that really well. And the whole idea of taking an unconventional path isn't really available to immigrants or children of immigrants, again, because of being in the name of safety and stability. I loved it. I really, really loved it. And I've never read anybody capture that specific struggle in a way that Caleb does. And I seriously, hats off to him for being able to do that. The next thing that I think he really captures is what it's like being an 18-year-old when you go to university, you're having these experiences. It's really interesting that I'm not going to go too much about what this particular character faces, because I think you should read it for yourself, but he struggles with it. And I think it's a very refreshing look into what it's like being a teenager when you're making these big decisions and going to university, being away from your family, your community, your friends. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. Going to university is exciting, but it is really hard. I remember I struggled in certain regards. I mean, I had other life stuff going on at the same time that didn't help, but it was difficult. It's really difficult because, you know, you have to put yourself out there. And if you're somebody like me who's super introverted, that's the last thing that you want to do. And I think he captures that really well, about that kind of inner battle of wanting to be a part of something, but then also kind of going in within oneself as well, and kind of owning our own identity and kind of being very kind of introspective. And I think you can do both naturally, but I think when you're that young, it can be very hard to grasp what that looks like from a practical level. And I definitely could relate to that. And I think a lot of young people, regardless of whether they're an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, can definitely relate to that. The other thing that I think he also captures really well is kind of young love and lost love. And I just think Caleb features love a lot in his books, and I think it's very precious and almost melodic. I don't know, that's the word that comes to my mind. But it's just very, you know, it's this thing to be protected in a way, and it's very beautiful. And even though, you know, your first love might not always last, and you see other people and you experience love with other people, you know, each experience that you have carries value, carries weight, and is something that you can learn from. And it feels very precious in a way. And I really, really liked it. Like, I really, really, really liked it. I mentioned earlier about how music plays a really important role in his books, and it does. In Open Water, there's, you know, mentions of some of my favorite musicians, James Brown, the Isley Brothers, The Roots. He brings that back in this book, and literally every page, every chapter is littered with musicians and artists, and it is just wonderful. If you listen to, you know, a lot of soul music, jazz music, hip hop and R&B, a lot of these references will be very familiar to you. If that's a genre that you don't know much about, then this is a great way to learn about some of the goats in those genres. And there's one bit where he talks about Jay Dilla and Jay Dilla's experience when he had lupus and he couldn't use his hands properly. And it just made me want to go back and listen to some of Jay Dilla's old stuff. So that's what I did after I finished reading that chapter. And I loved it. It also introduced me to some more music. Like, I'd never heard of the Ahmed Jamal Trio. They're a jazz band, and I started listening to them, and now I love them. And so I discovered new music as a result of it. So if you're a big music listener, like I am, then you will love this book. You will see familiar things, and you will also get new things from it. And I just think that is wonderful. Lastly, I will mention is that I think this author does a really good job of making this world just feel very normal. And I really love stories about just the normal struggles of everyday people and how they go through their life with the ups and downs that comes with life. And I think he does it in such a way that is so grounded in reality, because we have such a vivid experience of South London. I mean, I lived in London for a very long time, and even if you haven't lived in London, or South London specifically, you will get a very specific image of what South London is like from this book, because of the way that he talks about the community, the way that he talks about how people play football, how people enjoy food, how they dance. Like, it's just this very visceral experience. And even though that's a world that I am semi-familiar with, I think even people who have had zero kind of familiarity with South London and the Ghanaian African community in South London, you will get a sense of what that is like. And it's just really beautifully captured, like really, really beautifully captured. The other part of that as well is, you know, he mixes in real life events. I mean, one of the things that he talks about is there were protests in London a few years back because a young man was murdered by the police. And he talks about that whole experience of what it's like being black in London. And even though I'm not black, I am South Asian, and it's not something that I've talked a lot about on my channel. The UK, compared to other countries, especially countries like the US, I have to say it's probably a lot better than the US, but we still have a lot of issues with race. And I think he captures that experience of being somebody who is not white and who is the other very, very well. And it's super relatable. And I have to say, I mean, the main character that we follow, Stephen, he is a young black male. So that experience is very different to a young Asian woman. But there are parallels, and even just from my brother's experiences, I can definitely see parallels that I've not really seen captured in that way before. And I just think it was really beautiful. Like, I think the way that he presented it was very sensitive. It wasn't about presenting one side over the other. It was just about presenting the facts in a way that feels very authentic. If you want to get a sense of what that experience is like in the UK, then I think this is another really good book to read for that reason. So I'm going to stop there, because honestly, there's so many things that I could talk about, but those are the main things that I wanted to mention. I loved this book. I finished this book, and it's one of those books where I just sat there for a bit and I thought about this experience, and I recommended it to a couple of my friends because I just know they're gonna love it. I think if any of these things sound interesting to you, you should pick it up. It's super short. It's like 250 pages. You can get through it in a day. I read it within like a day, 2 nights, and it's just a wonderful experience that is very raw, very human, very real, and it doesn't hold back. This is one of those books where you'll get something from it, and you'll learn something about either yourself or another group of people or another community of people. So I obviously gave it 5 stars. It was perfection. There's nothing about this book that I would change, and I cannot wait to see what this author writes next. This review is probably going to go up just before the book comes out, so not many people are going to have read it. But if you have any questions, let me know. If you've read Open Water, the other book by Caleb Azumah Nelson, do let me know. Very different to what I typically review on my channel, but as you guys know, I do read outside of the bounds of fantasy, and it's just one of those really like raw human stories that I think should be told and should be read. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, folks. Stay safe and take care. Bye.